Every afternoon, the field behind me is filled with youth playing football, wearing their shiny red helmets and oversized shoulder pads. It makes me ponder what Paul might have thought of this scene. Perhaps instead of writing that we should wear the armor of God and carry the shield of faith and a blazing sword so we look like medieval knights wearing shiny metal suits, perhaps he would encourage us to put on the chin guard of God and wear the cleats of faith so we can run the field of faith. I also wonder if Paul were writing today, would he encourage us to wear the armor of personal protection equipment? It certainly would match what he had in mind when he encourages us to equip ourselves against the deceit of evil. He would recognize the importance of wearing personal protection equipment to protect ourselves and others against the evil and invisible virus which causes COVID-19. The urgency Paul underscores in his letter is that the spiritual forces of evil constantly surround and bombard us, causing suffering and death. He instructs the church to equip ourselves with personal protective equipment so we are protected from the daily struggle against deadly forces that surround and exist around us. This may seem like a stretch, as Paul employed the use of military gear as a metaphor, so we could go through the motions of actually putting on an item so we are mentally conscious and aware of putting up our guard to protect ourselves against evil. Paul used items that he and his immediate audience easily recognized. See, Paul was especially familiar with body armor, as these are the items his prison guards would have worn along with other armor. When Paul was beaten for preaching the gospel of Jesus, the Roman guards who arrested him for disturbing the peace would have worn these protective outfits. And other Christians who experienced beatings and charges of civil unrest would have also been familiar with these military outfits as well. Therefore, I suspect if Paul were writing today, he would likely use the things we are familiar with: masks and personal protective gear. Deadly serious, Paul instructs the church to put on the PPE with the same type of urgency that is being used by healthcare workers who insist that PPE is mandatory. This is not a drill nor a suggestion. Wear a mask, practice safe social distancing, no ifs or buts. Paul highlights the urgency we face, reminding us that we are involved in a struggle, and that struggle is not with enemies made of flesh and bone. Rather, our struggle is with the cosmic powers and spiritual forces of evil, which in a way sounds like he could be addressing the very virus itself. Though we know with Paul's letter, he's addressing the challenges that cause us to stumble. To combat this, he encourages us to follow God's protection protocols by putting on the PPE of God, which means we symbolically put on tools which help us. These tools are listening for God's voice, recognizing the truth, seeking righteousness, offering justice, and holding firm to our faith. Sticking with this modern ministry metaphor of PPE and their use to combat the evil COVID virus, there are 4 areas that researchers recognize as areas of our vulnerability, points of entry for that disgusting and wicked virus. Those are the eyes, the face, the body, and the respiratory system. Therefore, to protect ourselves, we need to put on the PPE of God to protect our eyes and our face, our bodies, and our respiratory system to defend against this wicked and evil virus. And as this relates to Paul's letter, the protective equipment to protect our eyes and face would mean protecting ourselves from the things we turn to when we experience a crisis. Paul encourages us to look to God through prayer. In our reading, Paul encouraged the church to pray in the Spirit at all times and in every prayer and supplication. To that end, he says, keep alert and always persevere. The next protective equipment for our bodies would be gowns or lab coats, or when things get really dangerous, hazmat suits. The protective equipment is a reminder that our bodies are to be treated like a temple. It is to be kept holy and clean. One of the ancient biblical practices still observed today in Israel and other places is washing your hands. I remember when I stayed at the Jerusalem Hotel in Israel, there were these cups attached to the sink, so when persons would wash their hands, they could wash their forearms as well. and then you use the cup to rinse your arms as well as your hands. This allowed you to actually rinse yourselves without coming in contact with the faucet. The reason for the forearms is that in Orthodox Judaic tradition, washing one's hands is more than a physical cleansing to get rid of germs and viruses. It's also a symbolic significance which connects the body with holistic health. Holistic health is when we connect our physical well-being to our mental and our spiritual health. By washing our hands, which includes the forearms, we acknowledge that our hands are important as they can do God's work for God's glory. And to wash one's forearm takes a bit of focused concentration so we don't get our watch or our sleeves wet. If you've ever tried to wash your forearms, it takes a little bit of concentration to get yourself completely rinsed. Symbolically, we are intentional with our actions so that we honor God. Wearing our PPE tools, we are reminded that our behavior and actions glorify God. So we wear righteousness and holiness all the time, being focused on what we're doing for God's good. The fourth PPE item is that one that we probably are getting tired of, but it helps. It's the mask. The mask helps reduce the risk of inhaling a microscopic virus, that unseen cosmic wicked thing, that when it infects someone, they may need a ventilator who can do the breathing for the victim. To me, this spiritually closely connects to what Paul addressed in his letter. Paul argues that we are in a battle against the unseen and the powerful cosmic power and forces, perhaps a mutant virus. Examining this ministry metaphor, we are reminded to be careful about the environment we live in and to recognize the symptoms of the illness. Some symptoms are listening to the wrong information or being surrounded by godless thinking, so we lose sight of God and what God is attempting to communicate. In spiritual terms, this is not a time to skip wearing a mask, which acts like the shield Paul describes in his letter. This mask or shield of faith will be able to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. In addition, the mask of faith is super valuable because it reminds us that we are vulnerable to truthiness. Truthiness is a term for lies that have just a bit of truth sprinkled in, so it sounds plausible, but yet is misleading. This is the fuel that feeds the conspiracy groups and some anti-vaxxers. There's just enough wrong information mixed in with truth that causes persons to actually believe there is a super spreading bank power with the sole mission of destroying us financially by placing chips inside our bodies, which transmit messages. So we lose control of our spending habits and thus causing us to lose our homes and foreclosures. And this is why it's imperative that when we put on our spiritual masks, we are protected from inhaling truthiness, because we are able to sort out what is false and what is true. Especially, this is important when there are persons who are vulnerable persons around us who are inhaling this truthiness. This is why it's also imperative we wear our spiritual PPE to ensure we are not invaded by unseen evil. We must wear our PPE of faith so we constantly remind ourselves to stay tuned to God, recognizing God's voice when God speaks to us. Jesus speaks of this multiple times when he encourages his disciples and the crowds who followed him to pray and attune ourselves into the right frequency to hear God's voice. Jesus declared in Matthew 13, "Let those who have ears listen. The reason I speak to you in parables is that hearing you do not listen, nor do you understand. But yet you are able to listen, but still you never understand. For this people's ears are hard of hearing. But blessed are you and your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Let anyone with ears listen." In today's world, we need PPE. We need it for the eyes, face, and our bodies and the respiratory system. We need it so we can put it on and recognize that these items symbolize our need to protect ourselves and protect others, especially those who cannot protect themselves. To quote Paul the Apostle, let us be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power as we protect ourselves against things unseen, recognizing that we can't attack it, but we can defend ourselves against it. And by wearing the PPE of faith and wearing our masks or our shields, we're able to prevent our spiritual energy from being sapped away so we can stand strong in God. And while we wear this protective equipment, let us be equipped to put on the faith of love and care and to put it into practice so we are caring for each other and ourselves, the most important part of the gospel of peace.